Ciao, I am Renato Floris, the publisher of all the entertaining and scholarly books on Rudolph Valentino by Evelyn Zumaya. I'm here today with Evelyn to discuss more about her fascinating work. Ciao, Evelyn.
Ciao, Renato. Today I would like to discuss some of the events in Valentino's life that took place during the fateful few weeks before his death in the summer of 1926. I begin by talking about H.L. Mencken's interview with Valentino, which took place about a week before his fatal illness occurred. Mencken's account of this dinner with Valentino first appeared in the Baltimore Evening Sun on August 30th, 1926, just a week after Valentino's death. Mencken was an iconic journalist, essayist, and humorist, and still widely read today, and I would say he's a great American icon and very much a part of American history. Now, Valentino asked to have the meeting with Mencken, and at that point, Mencken had never seen any of Valentino's films. He writes he was puzzled why Valentino would want to meet with him. What was bothering him? And Mencken found the answer to be first and foremost the Chicago Tribune article, which blamed the appearance of pink talcum powder machines in men's bathrooms on Valentino's influence. Valentino was furious with the editorial and challenged the author of the pink powder puff article to a duel. Mencken felt in writing that Valentino should have ignored the editorial, but I'm going to read an excerpt from Mencken's essay as he recalls that hot night in New York City. And I quote, "He, Valentino, should have passed over the jibe of the Chicago journalists, I suggested, with a lofty snort, perhaps, better still, with a counter-jibe. He should have kept away from the reporters in New York. But now, alas, the mischief was done. He was both insulted and ridiculous, but there was nothing to do about it. I advised him to let the dreadful farce roll along to exhaustion. He protested that it was infamous. Infamous? Nothing, I argued, is infamous that is not true. A man still has his inner integrity. Can he still look into the shaving glass of a morning? Then he is still on his two legs in this world and ready even for the devil. We sweated a great deal, discussing these lofty matters. We seemed to get nowhere. Suddenly, it dawned upon me. I was too dull or it was too hot for me to see it sooner. That what we were talking about was really not what we were talking about at all. I began to observe Valentino more closely. A curiously naive and boyish young fellow, certainly not much beyond 30, and with a disarming air of inexperience. To my eye, at least, not handsome, but nevertheless rather attractive. There was some obvious fineness in him. Even his clothes were not precisely those of his horrible trade. He began talking of his home, his people, his early youth. His words were simple, and yet somehow very eloquent. I could still see the mime before me, but now and then, briefly and darkly, there was a flash of something else. That something else, I concluded, was what is commonly called, for want of a better name, a gentleman. In brief, Valentino's agony was the agony of a man of relatively civilized feelings, thrown into a situation of intolerable vulgarity, destructive alike to his peace and to his dignity, nay, into a whole series of such situations. And Renato, as I interpret this, I think Mencken writes that he observed Valentino to be lost in the absurdity of his fame and afraid of his circumstances. In one more excerpt, which I will share, and I quote, "But Valentino, with his touch of fineness in him, he had his commonness too. But there was that touch of fineness. Valentino was only the hero of the rabble. Imbeciles surrounded him in a dense herd. He was pursued by women, but what women! Star-spangled passion that invaded his very deathbed. The thing at the start must have only bewildered him. But in those last days, unless I am a worse psychologist than even the professors of psychology, it was revolting him. Worse, it was making him afraid."
So Valentino's last days were not such happy ones then. Mencken recognized this.
Yes, he sure did, Renato. And I think Valentino's seeking out Mencken is an insight into how seriously he was trying to find his way. The Pink Powder Puff editorial affected him greatly, as his closest friend and manager George Ullman wrote also, saying that he felt Valentino would have had more strength to fight off the fatal sepsis infection had he not been so deeply upset by the entire affair. Mencken writes eloquently about the effect of the multitudes pressing in on Valentino and the absurdity of such fame. I do know that in this same time period, Valentino was also seeking advice and direction from other people, his godfather Frank Manillo, and even Jean Acker, his first wife.
Do you think Valentino was self-destructive then?
I don't think I would say that or go that far, but he was, according to many sources, including Ullman's account of Valentino's death, he was staying out late every night to arrive at the hotel in the early morning hours just before dawn to sleep through the heat of the day. I do not think this would necessarily cause his death, but it did not help his surviving such a serious illness in that he was drinking and smoking to excess. Ullman thought that the cigarettes had a tremendous impact on his death because he developed pneumonia at a time when he was, according to Ullman, smoking 100 cigarettes a day.
Yeah, Valentino has a cigarette in his hand in almost every picture.
He does. But I do not think caring for his health was his top priority that summer. No, I do not. But on the night he fell ill, he was out and about with his date for the night, a Ziegfeld Folly, Marion Elizabeth Benda, billed as the most beautiful redhead in the world. Valentino and Marion went to a party that night held at the wealthy playboy Barclay Warburton's apartment on August 14th. Marion gave some interviews after Valentino's death relating how that night he ate a ham and egg sandwich and felt sick. Now, Marion secured her place in Hollywood history going on that date, and known forever as Valentino's last lover and his last date. She would go on to have her own troubled life and claim Valentino married her and that they had children, or a child. Marion would claim she had Valentino's child in 1926. George Ullman refuted this by saying that some 35 women claimed the very same thing after Valentino's death. Now, Marion would marry 3 times, first to Bill Wise, a Los Angeles newspaperman who was killed in a car accident. Her second marriage was to Baron Ruprecht von Berkling, and she went to Germany to live with him. There in Germany, she met Blake Wilson, a handsome young hockey player. The Baron gave Marion a divorce. She came back to L.A. and married Wilson. Now, after several suicide attempts, I think reportedly 7, she overdosed on sleeping pills and died in 1951 at only 45 years old.
You know, you found more about the night Valentino got sick in a rare book room, and this is included in Affairs Valentino.
Yes, it is, Renato, and it was in the USC Special Collections Library Rare Book Room, where I went through the archive of Valentino biographer Irving Shulman. It was not a large collection of papers, but there was a scrapbook in there which someone painstakingly made in 1926, with clippings mostly about Valentino's death. There were a couple which I found informational, specifically one with a picture of the cab driver who ferried Valentino and Marion Benda back and forth that night. And I'm going to read this account from Affairs Valentino on page 330, as I have sourced the cab driver's account. And I quote, "Late that afternoon, Rudy showered, shaved, and dressed for yet another round of parties and guest appearances. His date for the evening would again be Marion Benda. They shared a late dinner at Lido's restaurant, and then stopped by Tex Skynen's before cabbing back to Marion's place just after midnight. After a 2-hour tryst in her apartment, elevator operator Frank Gross ferried Rudy and Marion down to the lobby and noticed it was about 3 a.m. when he witnessed Rudy hailing a cab. The driver of that taxicab, Mike Licalzi, then drove the couple to East 80th Street and Park Avenue, the apartment of playboy Barclay Warburton. Upon arriving at the address, Rudy left Marion waiting in the cab while he rang the doorbell of the prestigious residence. When no one answered, he yelled up towards the apartment windows and whistled through his teeth a few times in an attempt to rouse Warburton's attention. Receiving no response, Rudy decided to head around the corner, where he entered the building through a side door. Before long, he reappeared from the building's main entrance, paid cabby Lacozzi $1 for the 60-cent fare, and escorted Marion up to Warburton's apartment. That Saturday night, Barclay Warburton was entertaining a few of his friends in celebration of the news that his Parisian divorce was declared final that day. According to Marion's account, Rudy downed many drinks at the wee hours gathering, ate a ham and egg sandwich, and complained he felt rotten. The party at Warburton's continued until dawn, and by the time Rudy dragged himself home to the Ambassador Hotel, he was in the throes of what he believed to be just another bout of indigestion.
I know you mentioned in a previous episode how it was reported in the press that Valentino was poisoned or shot.
Yes, as I discovered in the book Sauce for the Gander by Frank Mellon, who was an editor at the tabloid New York Evening Graphic. Those rumors were started by the tabloids and were calculated to sell papers and generate a furor. George and his wife Bea were in the same suite in the Ambassador Hotel when Valentino arrived that morning after his date with Marion Benda. And George recalls the events in this way, which I will read again from Affairs Valentino, page 330. When he, Rudy, walked into the suite that Sunday morning, George and Bea were eating their breakfast in the sitting room. George looked up, quickly assessed Rudy's appearance, and told him he looked like hell. Rudy replied he would join them for breakfast in a few minutes, and then disappeared into his bedroom. He was in his room only a minute before George and Bea heard him curse loudly and groan. George was up from the breakfast table and through the door of Rudy's bedroom. He found him sitting on the edge of the bed, holding a tall glass tumbler. George said he was calling the hotel desk, requesting they summon a doctor. But Rudy waved him off, saying, "No, George, I'll be fine." He then began filling the empty glass with straight bourbon from a flask on his night table, saying he didn't want to be disturbed until late that afternoon because he had a big date that night. At one long gulp, Rudy swallowed the entire glass of bourbon, then stretched out on the bed and said to George, "See, I feel better already." Since this scene had been repeated for days, George shook his head and returned to his breakfast. On their way out for the day, George and Bea stopped by the hotel's front desk with a request that all calls to Mr. Valentino's suite be held until their return. About 4 o'clock that afternoon, the Ullmans returned to the Ambassador Hotel, and immediately upon entering the suite, they heard a loud groaning emanating from Rudy's bedroom. George was through the bedroom door for the second time that day, and found Rudy doubled up on his bed, clutching his stomach. Before Rudy could say a word, George grabbed the telephone and called the hotel desk, demanding a doctor be set up to the suite as fast as possible. The desk clerk knew that a Dr. Paul Durham lived nearby and placed the call. Within 5 minutes, Dr. Durham was making a quick assessment of Rudy's condition. He diagnosed Rudy's severe abdominal pain as a perforated ulcer and suggested he be transported to a hospital at once. Rudy balked at the idea and maintained more whiskey would bring him around. Dr. Durham and George denied this request and instead placed a telephone call to another nearby physician, Dr. Manning. Dr. Manning arrived within a few minutes, and after he confirmed Dr. Durham's diagnosis, George called for the ambulance. At 5:15 that Sunday afternoon, Rudy walked from the ambulance into the polyclinic's emergency room. Despite his excruciating pain, he refused to be carried in on a stretcher. Upon his admittance, he was examined by Dr. William Rawls, the hospital's chief resident surgeon. When Rudy explained to the physician he had been suffering from his symptoms for nearly 10 hours, Dr. Rawls feared the worst. End quote. You know, Renato, when I was interviewing Valentino memorabilia collector Bill Self, he told me he interviewed the attending physician we just quoted, Dr. William Rawls. This would have been in the early 1950s. Rawls told Self that the physicians knew when they first examined Valentino that his chances of survival were almost zero. This was because his abdominal muscles were rigid, and this meant the infection was too advanced to be reversed. In the days before antibiotic, any infection would have to be addressed quickly. But in Valentino's case, his perforated ulcer had been left too long, and I feel, although he complained about it, he was anesthetizing himself from the actual severity of it by drinking, as George reported he did on that fateful morning. If this had not been the case, he might have sought help sooner and lived. In any case, although it is a sad and tragic tale, as our listeners well know, I'm going to read some of the doctor's report, which was sent to George Ullman by the surgeon, and this really explains Valentino's condition and physical situation at the time. He says, "Dear Mr. Ullman, I examined Rudolph Valentino at the Polyclinic Hospital. He was suffering great pain, had a moderate rise of temperature, a very rapid pulse, a board-like rigidity of the entire abdominal wall, and presented the picture of a rapidly spreading, vicious peritonitis. A diagnosis of probably perforated gastric ulcer was made, although other possibilities could not be excluded at this advanced stage. I urged immediate operation as his only chance for life. The operation findings are as follows. The abdominal cavity contained a large amount of fluid and food particles. All the viscera were coated with a greenish-gray film. A round hole 1 centimeter in diameter was seen in the anterior wall of the stomach, 3 centimeters from the pylorus and 2 centimeters below the lesser curvature. There was no walling off by natural processes, and fluid was still coming through the opening. The tissue of the stomach, for 1.5 centimeters, immediately surrounding the perforation, was necrotic. The appendix was acutely inflamed from a secondary infection, turned on itself and so fixed by a plastic exudate at its tip and by an old band at its midpoint as to constrict the terminal ileum. Median vertical incision over right rectus, all possible fluid and foreign particles removed by suction apparatus. Necrotic tissue around mar of ulcer excised. The edges of the opening were approximated by mattress sutures through all coats except the mucosa. A portion of the lesser omentum was stitched with fine linen over this suture line. This was in turn reinforced by a portion of greater omentum over it. A rubber drainage tube was stitched in place with fine catgut. The appendix was removed because it was constricting the gut, otherwise it would not have been touched at this time. A second drainage tube was placed in the right iliac fauces and the abdominal wound closed. The patient was placed in bed in position most favorable to gravity drainage. He was in profound shock when put on the operating table with a pulse of 140. This condition did not change appreciably during the operation. Progress. There was a steady improvement up to the 5th day. Abdominal drainage ceased on the 3rd day. Pulse and temperature normal on the 5th day. On the morning of the 6th day, the patient had a slight chill, complained of severe pain in upper left abdomen and left chest. An area of pleurisy was detected. This rapidly extended. Scattered areas of pneumonia developed in the left lung. On the 6th day, there was a marked involvement of the valves of the heart. The patient died about noon on the 8th day, overwhelmed by the sepsis. The above is a true account of the last illness of Rudolph Valentino, as observed by me, signed Harold D. Meeker.
This medical report of the surgery is a very difficult thing to listen to. Yes.
So true, Renato. You know, as difficult as it is to write about or talk about, I think by discovering the stories of the two men at Valentino's deathbed and finding out that their accounts synced was so key in telling the history of what happened. As I have said before, Frank Manillo's family and George Ullman's 2 children had never met, yet told the same details as passed down from that day in the Polyclinic Hospital. I think Valentino's seeking out Mencken was an important insight into those days and Valentino's torment over the false representation of who he really was. This still seems to be something that plagues his legacy today. Perhaps this is why I found the fictionalization of his life so offensive. If there's no evidence at all, then presenting a great change to his story is fictionalizing it, and it does him no service. I'm going to read the few more lines, in fact the last lines, from the Mencken Valentino piece. And I quote, "Here was a young man who was living daily the dream of millions of other young men. Here was one who was catnip to women. Here was one who had wealth and fame. And here was one who was very unhappy." End quote.
I know that in the next podcast you want to read a special letter about Valentino. and we will record and air that next week.
Yes, we will, Renato. I will read a letter revealing another example of Valentino's generosity and how he liked to help people and do it secretly. This was true in the story of his Christmas visit to the Italian hospital in London, which we talked about in a previous episode. And this letter, which I will read in the next podcast, is especially beautiful in its sincerity and detail. I know it has been shared about, but you found it in French, and as an Italian, you translated this from French into English. It's a great translation. For today, I leave this somber subject of Valentino's unhappiness, his untimely and tragic death, and move again into future episodes to discuss his lively and lovely life. And I will get back to working, finishing a new book, which will be coming out soon.
It is a great book indeed.
Well, thanks, because it was your idea. I want, as always, to thank our listeners and thank them for writing in with ideas and questions, which I hope we have addressed here fully. I also want to extend a special word of gratitude to the intrepid archivist. You're awesome. And I want to say to visit the websites and read the books for much more. I also want to say in closing that I feel Valentino deserves the truth, the great respect that comes with truth, and in this truth comes a responsibility of stellar behavior in his name. As it was pointed out to me today when I was discussing this episode, the pain of Valentino's death was in great measure due to the agony he experienced in the week before his death. And as it was also mentioned, the agony of his lengthy deathbed certainly caused him to reflect. I know that in 1975, when Ullman wrote his second memoir, he was still passionate and angry, I will say, about Valentino's suffering at that time. So there's a level of decency that must be met by those marking his passing before his final resting place. Certainly that is not the case at all currently.
For today, I say to listeners to stay tuned for more and subscribe to this podcast so you don't miss any episode. And as the usual, fiat justitia ruat caelum. And for the good guys, arrivederci.